the Hollywood Cowboys series, which includes these two books, Hollywood Cowboys and Kiss of the Traitor. I'm working on the third book in the series, which is called Season of the Dead. And they're dark urban fantasy. They're very tongue-in-cheek. They're also very 80s nostalgic, is the best way to put this. It was kind of the era I grew up in as a kid. And it's kind of my homage to that era as far as horror movies, music especially. I was very influenced by music as a kid, and I still am today. And so it actually involves an 80s metal band off the Sunset Strip, and they get involved in a series of supernatural adventures, which eventually leads them to saving the world. Or trying to save the world, I should say. Because third book is not yet, maybe they don't save the world. We don't know yet. The band that takes place in here is actually from the Portland area, but they did like so many bands did in that time when they relocated to Sunset Strip to become popular. And of course, then they blew up. And they actually returned here to Portland to do a charity event for Dornberger's Hospital, and that's when they get involved in the kind of the end of the world apocalypse that they've got to try to save everybody from. All the while, nobody knows what's going on. They just think they're just this heavy metal band from Sunset Strip, but they got something else going on. I'm also the author of Dead Town, which is what I was going to do a little reading from today. And Dead Town is about a world where supernatural creatures have been let back into our universe via a gate called the Pit. But they're not quite the supernatural creatures as you think of them are. Some of them are very evil, some are not. Some of them are just kind of normal people, and they've tried to integrate back into their society. And there's what's called the laws of the Watch. And the Watch, the disciples of the Watch were a group of people who basically were wizards and sorcerers that had been kind of in hiding over the centuries because they had been persecuted as the years had gone by with witch trials, that kind of thing. So they stayed in hiding, and they operated in secret until the Pit opened up, and all these supernatural creatures came into the world, and then they stepped up to kind of put those creatures in check. And they developed what was called the Laws of the Watch, which was basically a contract with some of these creatures of how they have to behave in our society. Now, since not all these creatures kind of wanted to behave in this way in our society, a lot of them started settling in kind of the wrong side of the tracks in big cities. And every big city has got a settlement like this in it. It's called, and they all refer to it as Dead Town. Much like there might be a Chinatown or an Asia town, that kind of thing, and some of the cities around here. And in Dead Town, the laws are a little more loose. So they're able to operate outside of the laws, which keep them from, like vampires, from turning people without a contract. If a vampire has to turn somebody, they have to have a contract. They have to sign a contract about knowing what they're getting into to keep that vampire from being sued. So it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek as well. And it's about a band of misfits who, one of them is a supernatural creature, another one is an addict to a drug called voodoo dust, and another one is a bouncer in a bar, and how they kind of band together to save the world as well. So big themes going through these books, big themes. I'm also the author of my most recent book is Terminal Horizons, which is my first science fiction book. And it's a collection of short stories that's based in a universe where the stories are consistent to that universe. And it also has what I call a mosaic tale that goes through it, which features a character, John Wayfinder, who's unstuck in time and space. And he's trying to figure out why he became unstuck in time and space. And as he's trying to figure that out, he determines that it was an outside force that did that to him, and they did that for a reason. And he has several short stories that follow through this book that all tie together so that it actually tells a tale, but through different points in his life. And that just came out this month. So it's my first sci-fi book. I actually wrote it for my kids, to be honest, in some ways. So it's good for anyone from 10 to 72. It doesn't matter how old you are. Really, as long as you're young enough to get some of the more steeper concepts about time travel, that kind of thing, you'd be fine reading it. I wrote it for my kids because they always ask me, Dad, when can I read your book? And I was like, well, these books they're very adult. They're extremely adult. So, I told my son, when you're 16, maybe I'll let you read books, see how you do with it, kind of thing. But my daughter's only 10, so she's got a ways to go. So I said I've always wanted to do some science fiction, so I set out to make, a science fiction collection that could be read by anybody. It could be any member of the family could read it, and it's going to be clean. There's very little cursing, and I think I may have a damn and a hell in there somewhere. Nothing that kids don't hear on a daily basis from their parents. Or at school. So, as a matter of fact, this book, I actually ended up writing a story that my son influenced me to write. I asked him as I sat down, because he's a huge science fiction fan like I am, And I asked him, what kind of science fiction story would you like to see? What would you like me to write? And he says, I've always wanted to see a science fiction story that was a detective story. And I said, I like that idea. I can do something with that. So I basically wrote what is a classic locked room murder mystery, but I set it in a science fiction setting. And that was specifically for my son. And he enjoyed it a lot. he couldn't believe that I actually included it in the book. So, and as a side, we're all members, the three authors here are members of Northwest Independent Writers Association. And we started about 3 years ago now. And what we were is, I had just published my first novel, and I was going to a convention, and they were out of room at tables at a convention, but there was another author who was also independently published that was going to be there by the name of Adam Copeland, who was selling a fantasy book. They put me in contact with him, we met each other, decided to share a table and the cost. We did remarkably well at that convention. I mean, it was my first time ever doing anything like this. I had no idea what I was doing. We each ended up selling about 30 books, and it was a really good day for us, or weekend for us. But as we were sitting there, we got along really. I mean, we just became friends. I mean, instantly. We just meshed. And I was looking around all these tables, and there was like other independent authors all doing it on their own. And I looked at Adam, and I were the only two that were doing it together. And I was noticing we were actually selling pretty well. And I was talking to some of the other authors, and they weren't selling so well. And I kind of had the idea. I was like, well, we got all these authors doing this on their own. What can we do that could bring them all together? You know, what can we do that would to build support systems so that we could help each other with events like readings, conventions, help each other with book covers, editing, story ideas, whatever. You know, just be there as a support system. And I told Adam that idea, and he thought it was great. And we went away from the convention for about 2 weeks. All of a sudden, you know, I kept in contact with him. All of a sudden, he called me up. He's like, "Let's do this. We need to do this. We need to make this group happen." So we met some other writers that we passed out our information to at the convention. We got a hold of them. There were 6 original people that met at a restaurant and formed the Northwest Independent Writers Association, or NIWA as we call it. And since then, we've just grown hugely. I was the first president. I'm no longer the president. I've stepped down. Last year, Adam's now the president. Tanya, who is reading here, is the VP, or maybe future president. We'll see what happens. Either way, our group's grown, and our success has been phenomenal. That's like we were talking about the Home and Garden Show and how well that went for us. So,
how many people do you have now?
Official rules are
70.
70 is official rules, and those are the paid members. Now, we also have a Google forum where we have a lot of unofficial members, kind of lurking members, we call them. People that kind of come in and out, and they see what we're posting about. We communicate on the Google forum all the time. We talk about stuff all the time, and that's upwards of 150, I think, somewhere like that, maybe 170. So hopefully, those people will start to see the benefit, and they'll also. But I mean, 70 people is pretty good for a writers group that's only 3 years old. So yeah. So anyways, I guess I'll do some reading. Sounds good. All right. Now, oops. You know what? I need my reading list.
You're over 40.
Yes, I'm over 40. Actually, it was.
I discovered that I couldn't see the head and the eye of the needle anymore.
This actually happened this year to me. This year, all of a sudden, I realized I was holding books further and further away. I was holding magazines I was looking at my phone. I'm like, why is my phone blurry? I'm like trying to text on my phone, and I'm like, I better go have my eyesight checked. And sure enough, readers.
It was a nice case.
It was a nice case, yeah.
I had an appointment to see about glasses. I've needed them for a long time, but when I noticed it was when my kids hit kindergarten and they started putting things here in front of me, they'd go, "Mommy, look!" And I had
You
to go
can
like
see
this.
it.
A little range finder thing.
Well, it definitely. I mean, when you're reading, I mean, most of us I think will our books fairly close. And when I couldn't read the words, I'm like, "What's going on? I don't understand this. What's going on?" No, yeah. When my contacts off, I'm fine. And that was the weird thing is my doctor said my vision hadn't changed any, but I needed readers. But I was like, that makes no sense to me. But okay, be reading from Deadtown, and we will start with the prologue. Drop Dead Gorgeous. Simon knew a cliche when he heard one, but that's exactly what he thought the moment she came into the room. She owned the place. Just one glance around at the other patrons in the club told him they were all thinking the same thing. Who the hell is this beauty? Where has she been hiding? He knew right there, right then, that she'd be his. It happened as their eyes met across the smoky dance floor. Yeah, he knew. More cliche than an 80s sitcom. But what the hell is true love, if not cliche? Simon didn't even know her name and didn't care. She slowly sauntered across the dance floor. People parted, standing aside in awe of her animal magnetism. They all stared, unabashed by their lust. Men, women, and others just like this beauty. They couldn't help but admire her from the distance. She came right for Simon. Their eyes never wavered from one another. His heart beat so furiously it ached. His hands went numb, oblivious to the sweating drink in his grip. The Marlboro cigarette Simon smoked hung limp from his mouth. All other vices were forgotten for the moment. How could he desire anything else but her? She stopped in front of his table. She didn't have to say anything. Maybe she couldn't. His own throat felt so dry with anticipation, he didn't have anything to say to this beauty. If she did speak, he didn't know if he could even hear her over the sound of the club-thumping techno mix playing over the loudspeakers. He could smell her even through the smoke and cheap perfume some of the other woman wore. She simply smelled like heaven. Slowly, Simon found himself rising, moving around the table to stand in front of the goddess without a name. He looked deep into her eyes. He found himself drowning in their milky blankness. Simon wanted to swim in the rivers of burst veins radiating away from those pale lights of desire. Standing so close, he became overpowered by the fragrance of her stench, the fragrance of her decay. He reached out with his right hand to stroke her bare arm. The coldness of her flesh sent shivers of ecstasy up his spine. She stepped closer, her rotting lips parting to reveal teeth so stained that even the most industrious dentist could never bleach them white again. Simon smiled back at her. Pain. Glorious pain exploded through him as she sank those teeth hard into the soft flesh between his shoulder and neck. Simon heard the crunching pop of the bite even above the thumping music. Blood soaked his white silk shirt as she began to chew. He looked up past her brittle black hair at the dance floor. Everyone had stopped dancing, staring at them jealously. They all wanted to be Simon. They all wanted to be her. They all wanted to be undead. That's why they came here to Club Juju. Except for those in the club already in death's eternal embrace, everyone else just wanted to be near the living dead, or become immortal themselves. He grabbed her tightly by the arms as the pain started to buckle his knees. She wrapped one cold arm around Simon's waist, one around his back, and pulled him closer, showing Simon that her desire was mutual. His eyes began to wander around the smoky room as he succumbed to her advances. Simon couldn't seem to focus on any one spot for very long. Some bizarrely detached clinical voice in the back of his head told him it had something to do with blood loss and shock. Some people still stood staring from the dance floor. Others let their feet take up the techno beat again. In booths lining the wall surrounding the floor, people went about their night, now choosing to ignore this blissful union with the woman of his dreams. His thoughts wandered, aimlessly wandering about those in the club with him. He wondered about the dead, the living, and those caught somewhere in between. Simon couldn't seem to focus on any one train of thought for more than a second or two. He realized that the others in the club weren't that important. Perhaps they never really were to him. He'd been waiting his whole life for this moment, and this moment was all that mattered. The pain brought Simon his moment of clarity, his nirvana. Born to die? Yeah, born to die and live forever. His soulmate tore another chunk of flesh from his throat, and he staggered backwards into the table, knocking over his long-forgotten drink. Simon thought maybe the music stopped, but he couldn't be certain. The sound of crashing waves permeated his head. The sound became all he heard as Simon knocked the table aside and fell hard onto his ass, into the seat he had just left. Wave after wave crashed onto the beach. One long burst of white noise, a static-filled event horizon to define Simon's entire existence. Tunnel vision set in. All he could see was his one true love. She stood there, her face covered in his blood. A piece of Simon's flesh dangled from her yellow broken teeth. The tattered and stained party dress she wore positively gleamed with his life force. Now, more cliches as angels began to sing. Their voices rose above the rushing waters in his ears, and Simon knew he would be all right. His soulmate, without a name, swayed back and forth on unsteady legs. Their eyes met again, and he smiled weakly at her. He would join her in death soon. They would never be alone again. Simon's tunnel vision began to narrow, slowly, slower still, until all he could see was his love at first sight. Simon smiled, knowing she would be his forever. Darkness fell over him. Simon opened his eyes and knew a world of pain. Not the pain from his lover's embrace. He couldn't feel those wounds at all. A deep pain burned in Simon's stomach. It felt like a million piranhas eating his soul. Looking around, he found he was still slumped in the chair. Music and smoke still filled the nightclub's air. The crowd had thinned out. How long had he been sitting here? Much blood had pooled around Simon's feet. He glanced down at what remained of his left arm. Apparently, his one true love had devoured most of it while he waited here, he waited somewhere between living and undying. Simon lurched to his feet. It felt like standing on someone else's legs. He teetered back and forth, unsure of his balance. The pain burned so bright, Simon thought someone had set off fireworks in his head. The room spun out of control, and he fought to remain standing. He tried to focus, tried to see past the bright pain. Where was his lover? He didn't see her. She should be at Simon's side, waiting for him to join her in living death. She wouldn't go anywhere until then. They were connected, meant for each other. Opening his mouth to call out for her, Simon found it impossible to articulate his shock of not finding her by his side. Only a deep gurgle escaped. He reached up his remaining hand and then remembered his lover had kissed his throat as well. Simon's hand came away, bloody. Stumbling forward, he searched for her, still moaning in an inarticulate call. A living girl, bleach blonde and petite, smiled at Simon. He ignored her. She wasn't drop-dead gorgeous, and she wasn't his undying love. Pushing past those living, those dead, and those in between, he sluggishly made his way through the nightclub. Panic gripped Simon so tightly that he forgot about the pain in the pit of his stomach. He looked frantically, but his love had vanished. Simon's soulmate had left Club Juju. She just wasn't there. Somehow he found himself standing outside of Juju's front door. He tried to ask the bouncer if he had seen his lover. Again, just a wet moan escaped his lips. The bouncer smiled at Simon. "I see you got what you came for, buddy." "No, not really," Simon wanted to answer. Yeah, he had found death in eternity. But where was his one true love? How could Simon's death be any different than his life without someone to share it with? Simon turned and looked up and down Broadway Street. This late at night, the city streets were mostly empty. Only adventurous souls like Simon came out after dark. Only those creatures that owned the night as Simon had just become. He saw no sign of his love at first sight. Under neon lights and a blood-red moon, Simon realized that he would be alone in death as he had been in life. Alone with the dead, alone with a fiery hunger consuming his undying body, alone until he fed. Simon turned and lurched back down into the Club Juju. The bouncer, a tall, beefy-looking Hawaiian, grabbed Simon by the arm and held him for a moment. "She'll be back, buddy. Trust me. Just wait here for her. She'll be back for you." Simon gurgled an answer and went back into the club to wait for his undying love. That was the prologue. Chapter 1. Sweet